After 50 years now, I think we can say that, for instance, the churches, the pastors and so on who were ministering to remote Aboriginal people were doing good work because they were preparing those Aboriginal people for the modern world. At the same time, they were protecting them from some white marauders. They were also protecting Aboriginal women from their own elders and the abuse that would frequently take place in that society. But the direction was unmistakable. It was towards integration. It was to prepare people. And it worked. But all that stopped in the late 1960s, early 1970s. The entire Aboriginal elite and leadership are the consequence of integration. But then they learned this new game when they went to university called Aboriginal self-determination, and the price of Aboriginal determination is that about 20% of Aboriginal people are simply being locked out of the community, out of the modern world, and that's why the gap can never close.
Hello and welcome to The New Orchard. In 1964, America found itself at its post-war peak, the crescendo of the so-called Golden Age, where economy hummed, civil rights advanced dramatically, and a sense of boundless optimism and possibility permeated the air. That optimism and possibility gradually crystallizing into NASA's moon program and eventual Apollo 11 landing only a few years later in 1969. Of course, there's nuance there in this statement. Like any standout period in history, this one was not flawless, because racial tensions simmered across the country and Vietnam's Gulf of Tonkin resolution unfortunately planted seeds of future conflict so devastating to the United States. Also, it's obvious that Americans were deeply traumatized by JFK's brutal assassination in broad daylight. I think it's definitely worth accounting for all those things, but for the sake of the argument I'm trying to get across here, let's just agree that America, economically speaking, was in a very good place. Real GDP growth averaged 4 to 5% annually in the early 1960s. Median household income rose 2.5 times from 1947 levels, and unemployment dipped to 4.4% in 1965. Home ownership surged to 63% by 1964. Simply put, it was an era of the American dream in overdrive. New cars for everyone, TV in every living room, and more importantly, low housing costs with a median home price in 1964 as low as $19,000. Sounds like an amazing time, doesn't it? Now, it was precisely in this economic climate when President Lyndon Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, stood before Congress and declared an unconditional war on poverty. For all intents and purposes, a noble crusade backed by billions in taxpayers' cash. Let's have a quick listen to his speech.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. And I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort. It will not be a short or easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice. But we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it. $1,000 invested in salvaging an unemployable youth today can return $40,000 or more in his lifetime. Poverty is a national problem. requiring improved national organization and support. But this attack, to be effective, must also be organized at the state and the local level and must be supported and directed by state and local efforts. For the war against poverty will not be won here in Washington. It must be won in the field, in every private home, in every public office, from the courthouse to the White House. The program I shall propose will emphasize this cooperative approach to help that 1/5 of all American families with incomes too small to even meet their basic needs. Our chief weapons in a more pinpointed attack will be better schools and better health and better homes and better training and better job opportunities to help more Americans, especially young Americans, escape from squalor and misery and unemployment roles where other citizens help to carry them.
This speech was a statement of intent, not so much a clear articulation of the plan and definition of success. You can't really blame him for lack of specificity. In hindsight, his framing of the problem into a war paradigm I think is flawed, as that paradigm sets up the landscape for winners and losers, but that's just what American politicians love to do. They love the war paradigm with the war on drugs, war on terror, war on poverty and so on, as it awards them a license to burn endless amounts of taxpayers' money indefinitely, without clear success criteria or definition of endgame. LBJ in this speech said that the struggle will not be a short one. He said that the richest nation in the history of the world can afford to win it, and that the war on poverty will not be won in Washington, but needs to be decentralized to every state, every local council, school, and every private home. So far so good, right? This sounds like a very reasonable plan. War on poverty was a noble crusade, launched from the heights of American optimism, but for mostly predictable reasons, it turned into a cautionary epic. LBJ's 1964 State of the Union wasn't pie in the sky. It was a response to a shocking and visible despair in an otherwise golden era. As said, with GDP pumping at 5.8% growth and unemployment sitting at 5.2%, USA was truly the envy of the world. Yet, 19% of Americans, that's 35.5 million people, scrape by on less than $3,000 a year for a family of four. It's about $30,000 in today's money. Child poverty ravaged 1 in 4 kids. Imagine funding the moon program in that climate. Of course, something had to be done about it, and by August 1964, the Economic Opportunity Act birthed 3 key programs under the umbrella of a new federal agency called Office of Economic Opportunity. These programs were Head Start, Job Corps, and Community Action. Combined funding for these special programs was approximately $947 million. That's about $9 billion in today's money. Good intentions and decent level of funding, but how did things play out over the last few decades since the program started? And more importantly, why did they play out the way they did? Initial signals proved to be promising and positive. Poverty was slashed by 30% by 1969, down to 12.1% through direct aid and rights expansion, but the movement in the right direction slowed down and eventually stalled by 1973, with rates flatlining around 11 to 12%, despite radically escalating program costs. Charles Murray, a social scientist, libertarian scholar, and an author of a book titled Losing Ground, published in 1984, critiqued how the war on poverty was architected and executed, essentially not accounting for basic incentives and human psychology. Murray eviscerated it as subsidizing illegitimacy and idleness. From $947 million in 1964, spending on these programs ballooned to approximately $1 trillion annually by 2024. That's 5% of US GDP, up from original 1.2% in 1964. Cumulatively, since inception, a staggering $25 trillion, with some audits suggesting closer to $30 trillion by 2025, has been burned by US government on this war with seriously questionable results. The truth is that despite the administrative effort, despite the levels of this insane funding, poverty's grip hasn't loosened, it's tightened, breeding single-parent homes, welfare cliffs that trap the ambitious, and the growing resentment where hard-working individuals eye their paychecks vanishing into a black hole of dependency. I think Johnson's war on poverty didn't end it, it kind of institutionalized it. The poverty-industrial complex, which encompasses federal, state, local government roles, non-profits and private contractors focused on welfare, social services and anti-poverty initiatives, is currently estimated to employ anything between 5.5 and 6.5 million people as of early 2026, and that estimate is conservative. Like most of the industrial complex entities, it's now too big to fail, too big to reform, an out-of-control entity with its own agenda oriented around perpetual growth. I wanted to use the American war on poverty as an extreme example of throwing money at a big problem, and not only not solving that problem, but through an ability to properly grapple with complex systems, and comprehending and accounting for basic human psychology and incentives, making that problem even bigger and even more complex. The poverty industrial complex in USA is so vast and it's so intertwined between government at all levels, local and federal, as well as numerous NGOs, non-for-profit organizations, private institutions. The incentive to pretend that it's working and continue milking the system is simply too big. Don't think for a second that now almighty and benevolent AI will come in and will find a solution to this, because it will not. What is most heartbreaking is that in this vast machine, most of the time, it's the innocent kids who suffer most, paraded by proud and self-serving politicians as symbols, trapped in cycles no amount of cash can break. America's war on poverty, a $25 trillion leviathan, is a prime example of how not to deal with a problem of this kind. Now that we have briefly covered the basics of war on poverty in the United States, I want to shift the lens to Australia, where billions of dollars in a similar fashion flow into different Indigenous programs with the intentions of closing the so-called gap. In reality, the gaps widen, communities continue to fracture, and toxic resentment grows and festers. The Indigenous crisis in Australia isn't just lingering under the surface quietly, it's accelerating divisions and exploiting the vulnerable for political points. It's a very similar script: good intentions, terribly stacked incentives, and children caught in crossfire. I have been paying attention to this quagmire for a couple of years, wanting to better understand why things are playing out the way they are. To be very clear, I have nothing but deep love for Australia, its heritage, its original culture, the mystical and sophisticated spirituality of native Aboriginal tribes, the beauty of the land, the kindness of its people. The continuous build-up of resentment in the broader community, caused by collective inability to productively address the issue and find some form of permanent reconciliation, it really bothers me. It bothers me because I want the country to do well. I want unity for all citizens. I mean, that's just normal. So a couple of years ago, I have decided to look into it in detail and find out what is really happening beyond the noise, beyond the predictable self-serving political scripts and activist slogans. And in my attempt to do so, I came across a very interesting piece of work titled The Burden of Culture, written by Gary Jones. In this, according to some people, controversial book, Jones calls out the Aboriginal industry for what it is: a burden that stifles self-determination and perpetuates pain. What's great about this book is not just a well-articulated critique of the current status quo, but also a clear outline of the map, a path, if you like, to real hope, which is exactly what's needed if we want to take matters to a positive conclusion, dismantle the machine, and restore self-reliance. Before we get into the interview, let me just add a little bit more detail about my guest today. Gary Jones is a chairman of Close the Gap Research who played a prominent role in the 2023 Australian constitutional referendum on the Aboriginal voice to Parliament. In that referendum, he eloquently argued for the no case, which was overwhelmingly successful in defending equal citizenship in the Australian Constitution. He served in the House of Representatives and was Special Minister of State and Assistant Minister for Industrial Relations in the second Keating government. He also served as an Associate Commissioner of the Commonwealth Productivity Commission and as a Commissioner of the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profits Commission. He received the Centenary Medal for service to Australian society through the advancement of economic, social and political issues, and the Fulbright Professional Award in Australian United States Alliance Studies. Served at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. He's the author of many books, with his latest being The Burden of Culture, How to Dismantle the Aboriginal Industry and Give Hope to its Victims. I've got a fair amount of ground to cover with him, so let's dive in. In your book, The Burden of Culture, you argue that cultural preservation efforts and the structure of Indigenous programs often hinder socio-economic progress, perpetuating dependency and divisions in Australian society. To start us off, what do you see as the fundamental problem here, and how might we begin addressing it through practical solutions?
Thank you, Patrick. The key here is that often people approach a public policy question with presumptions, and the presumption will be, look, we're all basically the same. If you just apply enough money or whatever, all will be well. I start with a different presumption. I say, how are people behaving and what causes them to behave in a particular way? And I observe of people of Aboriginal descent, and I use that term advisedly, some are doing quite well in Australian society. Some have what I'd call integrated, which is to say they are able to run their own lives. It's none of my business how they do that, but as long as they're abiding by the law and working, paying taxes, the rest is up to them. But the dominant view in, if you like, among Aboriginal thinkers and the elite is that Aboriginal people should come together as a collective and self-determine. Well, you and I don't do that, you and I being, let's say, Anglo-Celtic or whatever. We find our own way in the world and we abide by rules in a more contractual way, although we may be close to family or friends or live in particular communities, whatever. But we don't say, well, let's collectively self-determine. So, for instance, I live in a suburb, I get on well with some of my neighbours, but if we owned common property, for instance, my neighbours and I would be collectively self-determining and we'd almost certainly be at loggerheads at some point. So why is it that only Aboriginal people have to be forced into this sort of situation where everything is politically, collectively owned, they have to sort it out? Whereas the rest of us can choose to own or not own things collectively, or choose to opt out and pay for someone to provide us services or whatever. So the presumption in Aboriginal politics, the dominant presumption is Aboriginal people are so different that they have a different way of living. I call that culture, and that somehow they must abide by that culture even if it's ruinous.
Have you by any chance read Charles Murray's Bell Curve?
Not in full, but yes, I have. Yes.
So you are familiar with its central premise, right?
Yes.
To me personally, the intent behind Bell Curve is positive, as I feel both authors were simply trying to better understand the foundations of IQ and heredity, ultimately taking that scientific and statistical knowledge to create better and, I think, more just policies for all humans. That is obvious to me. I do understand why this topic is a third rail to some, but I never understood why Bell Curve has been so aggressively condemned in the tabloid press. That noise caused some of the most vocal radicals to interpret the book as pure racism and caused Murray to very much go under the radar for a long time. Funny thing is that most people who criticized the book never read it. Anyway, considering your familiarity with Bell Curve's central premise, do you think some of its key conclusions apply to the topic we're discussing here today in any way?
The idea that a race or a people are, let's say, irredeemably different, I think is false. Or at least it's not something that can't be overcome. I much prefer the idea that sociologists and social scientists think in ways that say, look, the world is a blank slate. All individuals are the same. If some individuals are not doing as well as others, someone must be to blame, right? That's the wrong way to start. Steven Pinker has written a brilliant book on this called The Blank Slate. And he's really saying, well, why don't we start with the individual and their capacity? That is, the capacities they were born with, whether it's in intelligence or attitude. These things are pretty well passed on in our DNA. However, doesn't mean to say that someone can or cannot succeed. But you start with the individual and their enormously different capacities, and then you add in the cultural attributes, the way in which people are brought up, which is often determined by economic circumstances, and for Aboriginal people it was hunter-gatherers. There were almost no inventions over 50,000 years. It was all about isolation in a physical and economic sense, and they turned inward. They were called ultra-social. Everything was determined by your place in a hierarchy in the group, and all things that happened in the world were, in a sense, mystical. Now, that's thousands of years out of date. We are somewhat more enlightened now, such that we understand a lot more about what creates wealth or causes weather or causes the failure of crops or whatever, and we are not as a consequence, so ultra-social. We are not, by and large, totally dependent on a small group of people with whom we interact on a daily basis. By the way, neither are most Aboriginal people. About 10-20% of Aboriginal people live in remote communities, almost exclusively them. Probably, typically you might have, in 1,000 people in a community, you'll have 900 Aboriginal people, or people of Aboriginal descent, and you'll have 100 white helpers. And they are literally helping those people to death because there's nothing they won't do for Aboriginal people. And this sets up quite a foul contract that the Aboriginal person has learned, that apparently the white man's culture is that you whinge to the white man and he will give you things. That becomes the relationship. And the white man says, well, they fly me in here, they pay me wages, we'll deliver a program, and that apparently satisfies the Aboriginal person. So we've done this for, well, a very long time, but certainly in the last 50 or 60 years, where the contract is one where we deliver to increasingly unhappy Aboriginal people who can't see beyond this nasty contract that suits a couple of Aboriginal leaders, and it suits non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal public servants, but it does not get kids to stay at school sufficiently long so that they will become independent citizens. That's the killer.
Government spending on Indigenous specific programs is estimated around $5.3 billion annually, with broader expenditures cited as high as $40 billion by groups like the IPA. Amid recent fraud cases, such as the 2025 Northern Territory arrests involving an alleged $71 million scheme, how does this funding system contribute to corruption, dependency, and growing rifts between an activist class and the rest of the country?
The funding, again, is based on the notion of Aboriginal self-determination. And what happens is that increasingly governments are saying, if Aboriginal people run a program, it will be better. And even the Productivity Commission says this. Now, that's wrong. If you're going to have a government program, the only measure is, does it work for its purpose? If the purpose is to get children to stay at school long enough to learn something, then that's the purpose. It doesn't matter who runs the program. If an Aboriginal group happens to be better at keeping kids at school and having them succeed, I applaud that. The trouble is, the greatest non-urban myth in this whole field is that Aboriginal collectives, corporations and organisations are somehow better at furnishing services. And I can tell you, with probably 30 years experience now analysing these things, Aboriginal community control groups, they're usually called, are no better and frequently worse. And that's where the corruption comes in, because governments are often reluctant to properly analyse these things and audit them. I've seen audits which literally say, well, we hope things will get better eventually. They literally turn a blind eye. And this is from very senior departments, Prime Minister and Cabinet and so on. And on the private sector side, it's just as bad. So you'll have a mining company who'll do a deal with a native title group for access to the land. They'll put many millions of dollars into a trust. But the trust is blind. And to some extent that's okay. It's a deal between miners and native title holders. But a lot of corruption occurs within the distributions of monies within those trusts. And there are a lot of politicians who say, oh, well, we must open up these trusts and make sure the monies are used for better purposes. To which I say, good luck, because trusts cannot be opened up necessarily. Trusts are private arrangements, and there'll be governing documents that control who shall be the beneficiaries and who shall be the trustees and so on and so forth. And you'll have to go to the Supreme Court, a state Supreme Court, in order to open up those trusts. So just to round out the answer, the system's set up to fail because there's a presumption that Aboriginal people running organisations can do a better job. They can't. Their internal politics almost determines that it'll fail. And the second part is often the monies are simply tied up in trusts where no one cares to ask how it's used.
Where do you think this apathy comes from? What is that? With the recent expose of Somali daycare centres in the US, there seems to be more people, especially working class, asking questions about tax and why they should be paying so much of it with so much insane waste and corruption everywhere. Why do you think in Australia there's not more awareness of what is happening with taxpayers' money?
I think people don't want to know. For instance, the Voice referendum in 2023 was one of the few occasions in which voters were told they had to think about Aboriginal affairs. They thought about it for a little while and they said, no, we don't like this proposition to have two classes of citizens, and they went away again. So most people have no interest in Aboriginal affairs. They have a great deal of sympathy. They don't get much beyond that. They don't understand it. It's a little bit frightening. A bit exotic, and that's why the left of politics and a very narrow political class, which is increasingly run by Aboriginal faux professors, say, this is ours, we own it, hands off, it's not the white man's, and we'll determine how the money is spent, and which is a recipe for corruption. So it's to get enough people interested, I think, would take too much of an effort. I think it's better that we point out the positive story, that is that most Aboriginal people are doing okay because they escaped the collective. They got out either mentally or physically from their remote communities, and they junked. They got out of their culture. And we just have to keep reminding people of that and literally delegitimise all of those people who are sitting in universities saying, no, there's only one answer and it has to be the Aboriginal collective. That's what causes corruption.
Interesting. The latest 2025 Closing the Gap annual data compilation report reveals that only a minority of the 19 targets are on track, with worsening outcomes in areas like adult incarceration, suicide rates, and children in and out of home care. What key factors do you believe limit the impact of these evaluations? And how does the government's approach fall short in unifying society and achieving real progress?
Yeah, the key is, and measures are now more available than they once were, if you look at Aboriginal people in the city, they are doing about as well as other Australians. If you look at Aboriginal people in remote areas, they're doing appallingly and are probably going backwards. So the gap cannot close unless and until we address the lives and the behaviour of those people, not exclusively in remote communities and not just because they're remote, but there are different class of people. They are those who are still living a collective culture, still refusing, if you like, to learn the lessons of modernity, which is basically that we all have to be trained for many, many years so that we can participate, read, write, speak English, understand concepts, have enough mathematics to get through the day. None of that preparation is taking place in remote and many regional communities. It's an ignorance among the elite that is literally holding about 20% of their people outside the modern world, and they know it, but they need it. They need that sort of those horrible images to continually berate the white man and draw to themselves all of the power, attention and income that they get.
Mm-hmm. So they need the content essentially for the propaganda machine.
I think they do. They would never say that. They'd say we're terrible people for suggesting it. But after 50 years now, I think we can say that, for instance, the churches, the pastors and so on who were ministering to remote Aboriginal people were doing good work because they were preparing those Aboriginal people for the modern world. At the same time, they were protecting them from some white marauders. They were also protecting Aboriginal women from their own elders and the abuse that would frequently take place in that society. But the direction was unmistakable. It was towards integration. It was to prepare people. And it worked. But all that stopped in the late 1960s, early 1970s. The entire Aboriginal elite and leadership are the consequence of integration, but then they learned this new game when they went to university called Aboriginal self-determination, and the price of Aboriginal self-determination is that about 20% of Aboriginal people are simply being locked out of the community, out of the modern world, and that's why the gap can never close.
I find that very cruel. It's hard for me to reconcile all the pretend empathy that's floating out there to the reality of life for those communities, considering what you've just said. Your work critiques the so-called Aboriginal industry, where urban elites and organisations may dominate resources, often sidelining remote communities. With over 3,300 active Indigenous corporations registered with ORIC and a broader ecosystem employing around 120,000 people, including Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, land councils and local shires, how do these entities sometimes reinforce cultural burdens or mismanagement, and what reforms could improve accountability while supporting genuine self-sufficiency?
Aboriginal corporations have a slightly different life and operate under slightly different rules than any other Australian corporation, and they are registered with the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations, and their standards of governance are, if you like, supposed to be the same as any other corporation, but in essence, in practice, they fail often. And what will happen is that if an Aboriginal corporation is put into administration, typically, although there'll be an investigation and money may have been misspent, it's often the case that a regulator will say, well, that's a shame, we'll let that go, and we'll now educate the people for better governance. Educating people for better governance is just a ruse. You're really saying, here's an incompetent people who are at war with each other. They shouldn't be running a corporation. They should simply get a job with some other corporation, and maybe after a generation they'll be able to set up one of their own. So we have corporations that by and large came together as political associations, to seek equal rights, if you like, or to make a claim on land. A lot of them are native title bodies corporate. And there's no guarantee that having come together for political and other associative purposes, they're going to be any good at running a corporation. And we've got the wrong structure there. I think there shouldn't be such a class called Aboriginal corporation. They should all be simply corporations and governed under ASIC or the ACCC. Some of them are charities and they come under the charity regulator, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, which I used to run. And the same problems arise. You have people who are not focused on the purpose. What are they meant to achieve? Well, it may be, let's say, a charitable purpose looking after people. Instead, they concentrate on divvying up the money. It's a very different thing. It's very self-serving. And when you're running a charity, you cannot be self-serving. You cannot have a private purpose. The purpose must always be public, and that public in the sense of it's towards a group of people in need or whatever. So the whole idea, we really have to disassemble the idea that there should be an Aboriginal corporation. There should be corporations, and if there are people of Aboriginal descent who pull them together and run them, so be it. But the rules should not be any different.
Are you hopeful that this will change in the future? Because it sounds to me like there's a lot of support to retain the status quo.
The problem for many of us in this game is that we've given up on the Labor Party. They in fact devised a lot of this madness back in the 1980s. But the coalition have simply not thought about it much. They see the whole Aboriginal industry as, well, it's, Gary, it would be culture wars. We don't want to get into that. There are no votes in it, blah, 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 blah. And my answer to that is to say there will be votes in it if you say that Australians should be treated equally, if money should only be spent for purpose, if money's misspent, should be chased down, tracked, and individuals should be punished. If you frame it in the right way, I think it's a political winner. The real upside, of course, is you might change people's lives for the better, which I thought was what politics was all about.
Well, that would be really something if that was true, Gary. The way I have heard different people discuss the wealth transfer issue over the years was that at its root there sits a presumption that the vast amounts of money changing hands must benefit some other non-Aboriginal group of people somehow, and that's why there's no incentive to solve the issue. There can be no endgame. I'm being hyperbolic here, but you could simply take the total allocated annual funding and simply give it to the people in Aboriginal communities instead of supporting this massively overpriced, ineffective, and by the sound of it, unaccountable support industry?
Well, yes and no. I think theoretically there's enough money around. If you divide it among the many, there would be a nice little boost. But the trouble is, with that argument, of course, is that it's a bit like someone who wins a lotto. And it doesn't always work out well. It rarely works out well because they simply don't know how to manage the money. They buy things, and then and you can see in a sense a lot of Aboriginal groups win the lotto constantly. They've constantly been given money, whether it's mining money, taxation money, or they just ring up social services and get their monies added to, and then they gamble it. They gamble it away. In fact, one of the things that someone told me recently pointed out that gambling is quite rife in Aboriginal communities, but it was usually cash money. Everyone would sit around and someone would win one day, someone would win another. And then with the culture which is built around humbugging, that is, you simply demand money from others as you wish. The money did circulate internally in the community. What's happening now is that people are increasingly gambling online, so the money goes out of the community. This is just a sink. It's just a bucket with holes in it. So redistributing does no good. In fact, the whole industry is about grabbing your slice of the pie and redistributing it to my mob. And we're saying, for God's sake, stop redistributing. You have to earn that money as a person who earned it, not because you're of Aboriginal descent, not even because you're a native title holder, because you have skills that you contribute and help create wealth. That's the missing part in this whole policy area.
Would it be fair to say that the politicians who are the architects and executioners of these policies suffer from collective bigotry of low expectations?
The policy suffers from the bigotry of low expectation. The politicians, I think, are just too frightened to disturb the discussion. There's such that a new minister would come into the office and there would be the same press releases from the previous minister, and it would all be about a minister where you have to go and visit X, Y and Z, those people want to talk to you. We have a certain amount of money that has to be distributed in various programs, and your day is full just administering the norm, which is just hand out money. And I try as hard as I can to get ministers to say, can you just stop this for a minute? How many kids complete school? And they won't be sure, and I'll ask a public servant to tell them. And I can tell them already. For instance, in the Northern Territory, 4% of Aboriginal children in remotes attend school often enough to pass. 4%. That is 96% of Aboriginal students in remotes are never going to make it through the school system. So that's the end of them. They are not going to have a good life, and they will probably end up in jail and dying early and all the rest. So you tell that to a minister, and that's an official figure, I don't make it up, they just glaze over. I think they believe it's too big. Now in Queensland and Western Australia, the figure is 12%. About 12% of kids go to school often enough to pass. And I say to them, that's what it is, 88% under present circumstances who ain't going to make it, who are not going to make it. Gary, it's very difficult, blah, blah. And I say, yes, I know it's difficult. You know what's happening at the moment? There are a lot of good people running, say, boarding schools, raising funds for scholarships, and the scholarship will go to the 1 in 100 kids who are bright enough or good at sport, whom it's worth investing in. You take the kid out, you get him to boarding school, and they may or may not ever go back to the remote community, and you have a lot of failure because the cultural gap is so great. So and even Noel Pearson sort of admits this is only 1 in 100 who ever succeed. And I say to them, what about the 99? Can we at least think about the 99? And part of the answer, or part of the reason no one wants to think about it, is because that would suggest the end of remote communities. So all of those people who are so romantically struck with the idea of community development, I say, I have no idea what that means. We don't actually develop communities. People develop. We invest in their personal capital, if you like, their human capital, and they develop communities, more by way of moving into them or moving out of them or building a house or a business or whatever. They don't take a community as a given thing and say, can you just pour more money in here and all would be well. So the big split here that has to get into the minds of our ministers is that community development is a surefire way to keep people locked up in places where they will not have a good life. And investing in human capital is the only way out. The trick is how. Who has the skills here? Well, there are some, for instance, in Queensland, there are a couple of regional schools where you can go to an Aboriginal community, one of the slightly larger ones, I won't name any, and you can go from kindergarten to year 12. And you look at their results, so they're place-based, they're nearly all Aboriginal kids, none of them goes past year 10, and the attendance rate in year 10 is about 20%. So they're not even passing year 10, they're just hanging around. And then after year 10, no one seems to know, except for the 1 in 100 kid who happens to get a scholarship. So my argument is to say, okay, what do we do for the 99, and what institutions are big enough and knowledgeable enough, skilled enough to make an impact? Well, boarding schools are. Boarding schools are already looking out for children from remote communities, and many who are not from remote communities and barely Aboriginal, but that's another issue. But at least there's the intention, there's the decades of experience. And I say to them, how can we scale up your work? And there is a packet of money available there. The second phase of native title's been running for 30 years now. The first phase was to win your native title and then hope basically a white man comes onto your property and mines it and gives you some money. Second phase is that you've got your native title. For most people it earns nothing. There's no one coming onto the land. But you live in hope. You wait that at some stage someone, usually a state government, will need some access to your land, whether it's to put up telephone poles or whatever, put through a road, and then the negotiations start and you hand over some money. So in time, and I know state governments are very worried about this, as is the Commonwealth, there'll be more and more money handed over to native title holders. And I'm saying, during those negotiations, can you please ensure that some of the money is locked up in trusts exclusively for the education of the descendant children at boarding schools? And that's where I think the money can flow through. Perhaps the more powerful thing is not the money, it's the normalisation. It's to say it's normal, it's acceptable that your children must spend many, many years in education, and that they'll have to spend it away from the community, because we just can't have a high school sitting out in the middle of Western Australia where 100, 200 people live. It's not feasible. So I'm pretty clear on where we should be headed, but it's going to take a lot of conversation to get, I don't know, senior bureaucrats and politicians sufficiently interested and brave to have that conversation.
Yes, political courage is a rare commodity in today's world, unfortunately. As a chairman and founder of Close the Gap Research, which has evolved from Recognise a Better Way post-voice referendum, your organisation focuses on research-driven solutions for Indigenous adversity. How has this work built on the themes you have encapsulated in your book, The Burden of Culture, particularly in bridging divides between activists and broader public while advocating for policy changes?
Well, we took three really basic questions that affect Aboriginal people in need. One is recidivism, the number of people who go to jail and then are released and return to jail. Another one was the question of boarding schools, which we canvassed. Third escapes me for the moment. It'll come back, I'm sorry. Come to the recidivism one, okay? Now, a lot of Aboriginal people end up in jail. They are jailed because they commit crime. There is no secret about that. The question is, are programs, when they are released from jail, effective in tackling recidivism? So we undertook, as our research, a survey of nearly about 10 or a dozen providers of these post-jail services. And I undertook it on the basis that I knew one of the groups around Newcastle. Very impressive people, established by Aboriginal mothers who had one thing in common. All of their boys died. They'd been in prison, some died in prison, some died soon thereafter. So there was no shortage of what is now called lived experience. The question is, can they run programs that lessen the possibility of recidivism? And this mob, I think, do pretty well because they measure things. They say, look, every man, they've now got a women's program, but every man or woman who comes out of jail is guaranteed a driver's licence and a job as part of their 3-month program. And I say, well, okay, that's pretty good, but how many end up back in jail? And they say, we don't know. It's very difficult to track. We've asked the Commonwealth to use, their facilities where a person has a social security number or whatever to help us track them. The Commonwealth refuses, says it's a privacy matter. The provider says it's not a privacy matter. We have these men's and women's permission. So what I'm getting at is that governments don't ask key questions because they don't want to know the answer. The answer is which program has the greatest success in lowering recidivism. But governments don't even ask the question because they won't measure recidivism, say 5 years after. What they do measure, and this is what our survey found out, is really unimportant things like, did the man or woman enjoy the experience of the program? Well, I've been there. I know they enjoyed it because they're off the grog. They're getting 3 meals a day, quite nice accommodation. They're playing touch footy. They're sitting around talking, yarning, trying to rehabilitate. That's a good thing. I don't care about that. I just want to know, do they stay out of jail? So the problem is governments, state and Commonwealth, mainly health departments, just ask meaningless questions. Was the fella happy? Yeah, we know that. So we're trying to lift the standard of disclosure. The first level of disclosure is what my mates do is to say, they guarantee a driver's licence and a job, and they're trying to track how long that remains and how long the person stays out. But the ultimate is, tell me how long the bloke stays out of jail, and does one program have a better set of outcomes than another? Measure for measure. You've got to be very careful about the nature of the people and their offences, and age is a particularly important factor. And then we might get somewhere. But of course, then you'd have headlines, wouldn't you? You'd say, the best program in New South Wales has a failure rate of 50%. And that'd be the front page of the Telegraph. The minister just doesn't want to know that. They do not want those figures out there. So that's the sort of work we do. The other one was a big survey of schools and their scholarship programs. And we found that too often the school does not ask proof of Aboriginal descent. Too often the school does not ask about the needs of the child. And we say, if you're going to offer a scholarship, if it's a merit-based scholarship, there should be no race base. You just offer it on merit. If you offer it on need, there should be no race base. However, there'll be a lot of needy Aboriginal people, so it's likely that they'll be picked up. And so we're pretty unhappy with the fact that schools don't want to know. They just want to be seen to have their Aboriginal kid and to indigenise the school. So, sorry, that was another area we worked in. We looked at programs for, let's say, youth in trouble. And there are a number of these, any number of outlets around Australia. We visited numerous of them, where they're not exclusively for Aboriginal kids. They'll have a kid who'll sign up a contract for 2 years. And I'm deliberately not going to name names or the program here. Sign up a kid for 2 years, and the contract is you will study or you will start your apprenticeship. And you go into these places and the young person gets a nice little room and kitchenette and all that. I mean, if I were a student, I'd have been very happy with it. And the walls are always festooned with Aboriginal art and all the rest of it, because, there'd be quite a number of Aboriginal kids going through it. But when you sit down and you talk to the people who run these programs, and I ask them, I say, well, are they allowed visitors? Oh, yeah, sure, you can have visitors and so on. Do they stay over? Nope. Now, what's happening there is that the institution will play the game. Yes, we love Aboriginal culture and all that sort of stuff, but it stops at the door. The humbugging, we would call it bludging, stops at the door. Cousins turn up and start harassing you for money. You tell us, we'll stop them. If they want to stay over and sleep there, they're not coming in. Now, it's not explicit. They will never admit it. And they'll never write it down in a program. But those programs are doing good work because they're changing that kid's life by deculturising them. That's a terrible term. They are changing the circumstances in which they live, and they're saying to the kid, you've got to not only do your apprenticeship and your study, you've got to get away from the mob. You've got to get away from self-determination. And I can't give you hard numbers there on success rates. Again, people are pretty reluctant to own up to what's happening, but I'm quite confident that they're doing good work by understanding that these are cultural journeys. We're changing people as we find them with their capacities and their attitudes. Those are the two important things, IQ and attitude. And then their cultural immersion, the places that come from, the parents and so on and so forth. And you don't have much of a window in which to work, but you use what you can, you help the kid as much as you can, and you get them the hell out of there. You'll have some success and some failure, but if you don't even canvass the person as a person, if you see them as a blank slate and you leave them in their culture, they're damned. They'll never escape.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I have a quick supplementary question for you, if you don't mind, that was not in the original set I have shared with you a while ago. As a chairman and a founder of Close the Gap Research, have you defined with your team what the endgame success criteria is for this enterprise? What is that hypothetical point you're aiming to get to where you'd be able to dismantle your organization and celebrate the conclusion of its stated mission?
The success would be, there'd be no Aboriginal departments, departments of Aboriginal Affairs. There would be, our defining thing is need, not race. So a bit like that whole other industry, which is based around the Racial Discrimination Act and discrimination against all of the groups, whether they're LGBTI or women or people who are transitioning their gender and all the rest of it. You simply say, is this person in need, and therefore we should address their needs, however differentially, but we're not addressing them because of their race. There is no such thing as a First Peoples. There are people who are descendant of First Peoples, and they're no longer living in that world. So pretty much I think, Patrick, is that our end game is to remove the industry's struts by concentrating on looking after those in need. And when you look after people in need with one object in mind, that is to make them able to operate in the world and to never, ever consider their race or culture or gender or anything else as other than an intermediary, something that has to be understood because you need to understand the purpose. There is no end point in toadying to those subcategories.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Before this interview, I have asked you to read through an editorial titled Ending the Civil War on Race and Culture, which was published on democracyfirst.org.au. That editorial contains an idea of national settlement, which suggests finalising land claims, ending race-based entitlements, and shifting Australia Day to celebrate unified achievements as a way to end culture wars. While you've indicated limited support for this when we were exchanging our emails, how do you assess its potential to resolve ongoing divisions and promote societal unity? Or what alternatives might better align with your views on alleviating cultural burdens?
Well, I have sympathy with the idea that we should end land claims. In a sense, they are coming to an end. You know, there are very few parts of Australia now that have not been successfully claimed that can be claimed. So saying we should put an end to it doesn't take us far. We're already in that process. It also doesn't help us with the next phase of native title and other Aboriginal land title, which is to keep milking those titles for money, which is really based on the production of others, the non-native title holders, although many are trying to build businesses and so on, and where they succeed, I say congratulations. The January 26th thing, we can move it around all you like. It will not stop the very radical groups saying, we were here first and you shouldn't have come here. Whether it occurred on January 26 or October 10 or whatever, they won't care. They'll simply keep at it to say, we were here first, you owe us. Because that is their stock in trade, that is their business model, that is their political ideology. We're different, we're special. I'm a descendant of someone was here first. And it doesn't take much to overcome that. All you have to do is say, so what? I don't care. You don't deserve it. You know, morally, you deserve nothing more than any other Australian, other than on the basis of need through our normal processes of social security transfer payments and so on. You can set down some goals like ending land claims and changing the date of January 26, but you're really not getting to the heart of the matter, which is to say, on what basis do these radicals make these claims? So, for instance, every university in Australia now has a pro-vice chancellor, brackets, Indigenous. They're trying to, it's usually a person of Aboriginal descent, usually very remote Aboriginal descent. They usually add nothing of intellectual rigour, but they're meant to be indigenising the curriculum. What the hell that means, I don't know, but they keep themselves very busy. And again, they simply invent things, new knowledges and so on and so forth. And that keeps them very busy, but it's so destructive. Now, if this group you mentioned were to say we should abolish all such positions, any position that mentions a group on the basis of race, I would support that.
You move around in elite political circles, so I hope you don't mind me asking this. In historical assessment of outcomes, it's worth looking at counterfactuals. I appreciate this might strike you as a naive question, but I'm curious, so I'm asking it anyway. Why do you think our political elites are so reluctant to play with historical counterfactuals? Let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's assume that there was a timeline where European maritime superpowers agreed amongst themselves to never settle Australia for whatever reason. No English, French, Portuguese or Spanish touching this land. Then sure as hell some other non-European power would come in and take over. Chinese or Imperial Japanese pre-World War II. Is that a conversation in political circles at all?
It isn't. We're very lucky that one group took over the whole of Australia. What happened to be the British. You know, it could have been the French, Spanish, Dutch, more likely, possibly the German, and more latterly Chinese and so on. we could have actually had a continent with 3 or 4 different groups. You know, the Dutch might have had the West, and the French might have had the South, and the Brits might have had the North. And we'd have had these constant, wars or negotiations, different languages, etc., etc. So we could at least say 2 things. One, Aboriginal people could never have held these lands against modern forces. 2, they were very lucky they were taken by one group in particular who were almost certainly the most benign colonialists. And remember, the British were the colonialists that stopped slavery in the world. They were actually church, white Christian men stopped slavery in the world. So it'd be nice to have those simple conversations, that simple knowledge that children should be taught, but until they are, it's going to be very difficult to turn this conversation around.
Let's go back to the Democracy First editorial I've mentioned earlier. One of its sections promotes the empowered communities model, pioneered in regions like Cape York as a replacement for welfare-heavy approaches, emphasizing local decision-making to decommission race-specific programs. I appreciate you have already talked about this, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to add. So, given your reservations, how viable is this for reducing funding corruption and closing gaps? And what modifications or other models would you recommend instead?
Empowered communities is a title. It says, let's have community development, but we'll do it a bit differently. And typically what happens is that there'll be a new program come in, some new people will seek to operate it. But essentially it's public servants of whatever, persuasion, colour, whatever, telling the communities that we'll sit down and give you money and we'll talk endlessly about what we should do to, quote unquote, develop your communities. You can call them empowered communities, you can call them disempowered communities, you can call them whatever you want. You're still trying to make something that cannot occur. You cannot develop a community where there is no economic base. You cannot develop a community where there are very few skills. So the empowered communities thing is just a renaming of various programs that have been running for 50 years. They're usually associated with Noel Pearson and others, who has a brilliant way of retitling things and persuading politicians to throw more money at these programs. But ultimately, communities can't be developed by community programs. Only individuals, through personal investment and their own brilliance and insights and hard work, lead to communities. All community development should be stopped. It's just it's not only a waste of time, it's delaying the point at which people need to invest in themselves or get out of those communities.
All right, this is the penultimate question I got for you. With persistent challenges and outcomes despite decades of investment, what essential policy shifts would you prioritise to ease the burden of culture, curb systemic issues like corruption, and help government foster a more unified Australian society?
The major shift is to normalise the investment in children and to understand that it's almost impossible to invest in an Aboriginal child in a remote community long enough to change that child's life. In other words, we've tried to have local primary schools in dual languages and all the rest of it. But until people, Aboriginal parents as well, understand that, I'm sorry, but your child will have to be at school attending for 10 years, otherwise they will never be free of the burden of their culture and the burden of this community. So that's going to have to be said 1,000,000 times until it's normal that children will attend school, will probably leave their communities, and in fact the communities will simply close down. I'm not suggesting at all, that you close communities and move people closer to town. That won't work because those people are not ready to live in town. It'll have to be a slow process of normalising what I'd call the coming in, the last wave to come in, who were prevented way back in the late 1960s when, the great intellects thought that they could build a new Jerusalem based on inadequate capital. And that's cruelled the lives of so many Aboriginal people, especially in remote communities.
Mm-hmm. Finally, instead of going out there protesting every day, screaming at people, cultivating deep resentment, what can individuals that are interested in making real-world impact, creating a tangible outcome, especially for those young Aboriginal kids, helping your organisation to do its job, what can such individuals do? Do you have any clear guidance you could provide?
Yes, take people one by one. Just help one person to have them live a better life. And one by one, instead of having about 80% of Aboriginal people doing okay and 20% not, we might just shift the dial. And we'll also shift the conversation. It'll concentrate on an individual, their capacity, their abilities. And that, there are wonderful people around Australia in all sorts of groups, including charities, who concentrate on helping the individual as they find them in their circumstances and seeing if they can change their life for the better.
Gary Jones, thank you very much for putting the effort and writing The Burden of Culture and shining a bright spotlight on these issues. And thank you very much for your time today.
Patrick, thank you for having me.
So there you have it. This was Gary Jones, author of The Burden of Culture and chairman of Close the Gap Research. I sincerely hope you found his answers to my questions informative and valuable. I can tell you I have. I think he's a good man, and I think he's trying to make a positive impact. And before some of you get your knickers in a twist and start criticizing him, please read his book. Read it with open mind and curiosity. If you truly care about this topic, I believe you'll be able to find some valuable guidance in it. Naturally, you don't have to agree with everything, and if you feel like you have an interesting counter to his ideas and think you have a better path forward, please write to me and let's talk. I'm really keen to hear from you. Just a couple of caveats before we conclude today. First, I've mentioned this very briefly in my introduction. Personally, I believe the pre-colonial Aboriginal tribes exhibited profound spiritual dimensions, unlike any other tribes anywhere else in the world in known history. They were so isolated from the rest of the world, they've landed on this alternative developmental path which is easy for modern-day materialists to criticize as backward. Spiritually, metaphysically speaking, it was anything but backwards, and I don't mean to romanticize, but modern minds, so conditioned by materialist science, lack the basic comprehension toolkit to truly understand what was going on here on this land for thousands of years. In the not-too-distant past, there were really good scholars, good anthropologists who approached their research into these matters from non-materialist perspectives, drawing on anthropology, philosophy and phenomenology, and they avoided reducing it to simply empirical or sociological explanations. I'd recommend you check out the work by William Edward Hanley Stanner or Adolphus Peter Elkin. I'll put some links in the show notes for you if you're interested. The deeply unique qualities of the native society who inhabited this land unfortunately did not survive the clash of civilizations when English settlers arrived and changed this land forever, building one of the most impressive countries in under 200 years. The build-up was relatively fast, at times brutal, and in most cases totally incompatible with the tribal philosophy of the natives. They had no chance, and what we're seeing today in modern-day Australia is a very weak afterglow of that original culture, with a lot of cosplay as a box-ticking exercise to please certain metro voters and politicians. At least that's my take on it, and I truly do not mean to offend anyone by saying this. This is just my opinion. Sadly, this outcome was very much inevitable, and this leads me to my second caveat. I like to play with counterfactuals, despite the fact that I will never really know how things would have played out if the English didn't decide to send their first fleet and start settling Australia. Truth of the matter is that the land we now call Australia has been completely cut off from the rest of the world, and by virtue of that has not developed in a similar way to other regions of the world, both technologically and politically, being very simple, economically unsophisticated, lacking collaboration between different tribes, made this place incredibly vulnerable. There is zero chance in hell that the outside world was going to ignore Aboriginal Australia. In a scenario where European colonial powers like Britain, France, Netherlands and so on agreed via some kind of a treaty, a post-Cook Voyagers Pact, deeming Australia off limits for, let's say, ethical or strategic reasons, the absence of colonial might and pressure would likely allow other nations in Asia-Pacific region to make a move instead. Unless European seafaring powers also agreed to protect this land from potential invaders, which is highly unlikely considering the distance between Europe and Australia, as well as Australia's massive size. This simply would not be feasible for prolonged periods of time. There's quite a lot of these counterfactual timelines worth contemplating, with my favourite one being the settlement by Japan. Now, Japan had isolationist policies until 1854, but with no European presence in the region, would likely target Australia as a low-hanging fruit that's easy to pick. Maybe it would start with simple voyages for whaling and timber, but post-Meiji period from 1868, an expansionist Japan would likely take control of the entire continent, leading to a highly militarized and industrialized Australia by 1900, functioning as a southern empire and grand outpost of the mainland. Now, if you know the actual history of Japan between 1868 and the conclusion of World War II, you probably have a very good understanding how Japanese treated people in occupied territories. What would they do to the indigenous population of Australia? Let's do one more. In 1835, two iwi tribes from New Zealand's North Island chartered a European ship called Lord Rodney. That ship took around 900 warriors plus their women and children to Chatham Islands, 800 kilometers east of New Zealand's South Island. The inhabitants of the islands were called the Moriori and essentially practiced a centuries-old pacifist traditions called Nunuku's Law, which prohibited killing and warfare. They have kindly offered peaceful coexistence with the new Maori settlers, who just arrived from New Zealand, but were met with brutal violence. The invaders slaughtered an estimated 200 to 300 Moriori. That's about 10 to 20% of the pre-invasion population of about 1,500 to 2,000 people, often in mass killings or through ritual cannibalism, and then enslaved the survivors, forbidding them from marrying or reproducing among themselves. By the 1860s, the Moriori population had collapsed to around 100 people due to disease, enslavement and displacement, effectively constituting a genocide. To provide a bit of additional context, yes, the invading Maori did get to Chatham Islands using what was then a modern piece of technology, a modern ship, not a traditional canoe. That said, it is evident from historical records that Maori were highly skilled navigators for centuries, with their ancestors crossing vast Pacific distances in their waka from eastern Polynesia to New Zealand, using stars, ocean swells and bird patterns without any modern instruments whatsoever. I think they would, given enough time, figure out how to conduct a journey across the rough Tasman Sea and set up shop in Australia. A lot of scholars disagree with that scenario, but I personally find it reasonable and interesting. Would native tribes of Australia survive a clash with the Maori? I think it's worth thinking about that scenario as well. One last thing. At the beginning of the interview with Gary Jones today, I asked about Charles Murray's bell curve and applicability of insights and conclusions contained in that book to the themes covered in Gary's Burden of Culture. In hindsight, I'm just openly admitting that this was a poorly formulated question, and the only reason I didn't edit it out is because my guest's response is very interesting. I read the bell curve probably well over 10 years ago, and I understand why its critics point to methodological flaws and issues with some of the conclusions contained in Murray's work. There's nuance there for sure that should not be ignored, but as said before, most people who viciously criticize the bell curve also admit to not having read it properly or read it at all. If you want to gain clear understanding of the world around you, you will absolutely have to read things that are sitting outside of your comfort zone. It's as simple as that. Read the book and make up your own mind before you call it racist or slander the author. As always, all the key links in the show notes for you. Thanks for joining us today. and I hope to see you next time.